Merhaba. Hi everyone. Welcome. Today we're so excited to have Tarık Ali with us, writer, historian, and filmmaker. He's he's going to talk about the exhibition upstairs, 1+8 Turkey and its 8 borders. So I would like to say welcome to him and to you all, and enjoy. Thanks.
I'm very grateful to SALT in Istanbul for having invited me. We live in times where sometimes the only place where we can speak up and speak the truth is in art galleries and literature festivals and institutions like this, because it's very difficult to do that in the more official arenas of the Western world and those of its allies. The occasion for this talk is, of course, the wonderful exhibition which is taking place upstairs. Films, very powerful artistic films made about the people, Kurdish people who live on the borders of Turkey. And it's totally relevant to the subject which I am going to speak to you about, because the leaders of the Turkish government today said that they wanted nothing more but to be at peace with all their neighbors. So this exhibition gives us a good opportunity to discuss how far this hope has been fulfilled of being at peace with one's neighbors. And given current developments in this country about being in peace not only with one's neighbors but with sections of one's own population. So let me start by putting the Turkish situation in a broader context. Sometimes we get so caught up in immediate issues or the latest image we've seen on television that we forget to contextualize what is taking place, because we live in a world where decontextualization is the order of the day. The images which appear on the television screens of the Western world and its allies are usually decontextualized to whip you up to support a war without understanding the context of what is taking place and why what is happening is happening. And I start with a wonderful remark made by the great 14th century scholar and Maghrebian historian Ibn Khaldun, who the late Eric Hobsbawm, one of the great historians of the 20th century, said that Ibn Khaldun is the father of modern history. Without him, we would not be where we are today in terms of understanding history. And in his great work, the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun both made a critique of what Arab history had been up till now, until his time in the 14th century, and also began to develop a methodology of understanding history and analyzing it. And one of the things he said is still very apposite and relevant to the world in which we live today. He said that dynasty and government serve as the world's marketplace, attracting to it the products of scholarship and craftsmanship alike. Both trade and ideas are often put at the service of the rulers. That is what he was saying. Then he said, wayward wisdom and forgotten law forgotten stories turn up there. In this market, stories are told and items of historical information are delivered. Whatever is in demand in this market is on demand, in general demand, everywhere else. When this market and the dynasty, and you can substitute for it today the American empire or the international community, when it is influenced by selfish interests and rivalries, or swayed by vendors of tyranny and dishonesty, the wares of its marketplace become as dross and debased metals. The intelligent critic must judge for himself as he looks around, examining this, admiring that, but always choosing the other. Now, if you look at what he's saying, is that don't trust what you see. Try and understand it. And I think if we follow that advice and look around at today's world, 2 years after the beginning of the Arab Spring, as it was christened by the media, where are we? I tell you all this because without it, it's impossible to understand some of the things that are going on in your country today, in my opinion. So we first saw the West taken by surprise by the events in Tunisia and Egypt, totally taken by surprise, trying to save those governments and failing to save those governments. That is, of course, if we accept that the Arab Spring started just 2 years ago. I would suggest to you that the beginnings of this new change of mood in the Arab world started in the Maghreb in 1988, when there was a huge wave of strikes and mass demonstrations in Algeria, and the Algerian government had to agree to elections. And in those elections, the Islamist Party was winning in the first round. It was obvious that they were going to sweep a big victory in the second round. And in between the first round and the second round, the French Foreign Ministry, backed by the United States, said, do not allow these elections to continue, stop them. So they stopped the elections halfway, and the whole country knew they had been cheated. What happened? 2-3 years of civil war in which 100,000 people died, at least. Many were tortured. Both sides began to commit terrible atrocities against the other. That spring was crushed right from the beginning. Why? Because the United States had an idea, and so did its European allies, that anything which had to do with Islam and Islamism was going to prove problematic because they would automatically back the Palestinians, and if they backed the Palestinians and this process spread, then the entire basis of US foreign policy in the Middle East, which is Israel is the central, most important thing for them, could collapse. It would put too much pressure on Israel. So they stopped the Algerians from pushing through with the elections. But times have changed. After 9/11, Condoleezza Rice discovered that there was such a thing as moderate Islam. I think it may have been after a visit to Turkey. I'm not sure. But she discovered it in any case. And then what happened? Then they decided that it was wrong just to stop processes from developing. You had to work with the new people and win them over, which was not a very heavy requirement, as it so turned out. And they began to do that. And they did it systematically. And that process, which began after 9/11, has now reached a fairly critical and important stage. That the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt jolted the Western powers into accepting that you could have conservative Christian democratic type parties which were not Christian democratic but Islamic parties. And they began it was Turkey that convinced them that this was possible. Initially they were nervous, but once the new Turkish government in place decided to effectively abandon many of the views it had held before and many of the views held by its supporters. I mean, I don't need to remind you the first vote of the Majlis against the war in Iraq, and then the changes which took place rapidly afterwards, especially after Erdogan came into parliament himself, and then backing the invasion of Iraq and even offering troops to occupy Iraq. Only stopped because Talabani and the Kurds in Iraq opposed that, and Bush wanted to punish them a tiny bit for having voted against allowing American troops in Turkey in the first place. That's the only reason. So all talk of anything remotely different in terms of foreign policy, apart from rhetoric, apart from public relations gestures, disappeared completely. Afghanistan, Turkish troops were sent into Afghanistan. One of the great leaders in your government explained the sending of Turkish troops to Afghanistan, saying, we are only sending them to help NATO maintain the peace. No one in the NATO High Command even accepts that stupid argument now. Why? Because they know what's happened in Afghanistan. Because since the occupation of Afghanistan in October 21, 11 years later, the situation has got worse and worse and worse. And why? Some of us told them, we wrote articles, we published them, I spoke in the United States and said, one thing you have to understand about Afghanistan, which many big powers have failed to understand in the past, is that the Afghan people have this strange characteristic. They don't like being occupied. Many countries don't mind being occupied, either literally or politically. But the Afghans had never liked it. The British tried to occupy them in the 19th century and they drove them out. Even though they were very badly armed, they drove the British out. The Russians tried it in 1979, and actually probably that occupation did one or two good things. They built schools and hospitals, they educated women, but finally the Afghans said, we don't want to be occupied, get out. So the Russians left. Organized retreat in 1989, they left. And then after 9/11, NATO, the United States, backed by NATO, decided to do the same thing. And the result now, 11 years later, is exactly the same. They can't control the country. They tell open lies that we are basically building an Afghan force which will manage the country without us. And it's not the case. Again, I wrote this in public, that if you think all the people who are joining these police and military groups to get military training and weaponry are on your side, you are dreaming. And we have had now several incidents of official policemen and official soldiers attacking the occupying armies and damaging them quite severely. One attack, they actually destroyed an intelligence operation because they knew where it was, they knew how it was happening, and they went in and and they were wearing Afghan military uniform, and they were Afghan soldiers, but they were just supporting the people fighting the occupation. So it doesn't work like that. Now, what about Turkey? Historically, this country has decided always to back, even in the last days of the fading Ottoman Empire, made a huge disastrous mistake in deciding to back Germany in the First World War, which cost them almost everything. It enabled the British to take over the Ottoman Empire with the French in the Middle East, which is what is partially created the situation we find ourselves in today. And subsequently, especially after the Second World War, but even before, they aligned themselves with another Western power, and after the Second World War, they became staunch members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, very proud to be NATO's eastern flank. What good did that do Turkey, or the Turkish people, or their interests, except to make them part of a vicious and ugly Cold War, which was fought for 70 years? Okay, so the Cold War is finished. Communism, the old enemy, has collapsed. So what is the point of NATO? NATO never fought a single war during the existence of the Soviet Union. Not once. So what is to be done with NATO after the collapse of communism? What is to be done is to keep it going and make it an instrument openly and nakedly of US foreign policy. Bush was very open about this, and he was right. He said, look, we try and use broader mechanisms when we can. We try and use the United Nations. If we have problems there, we use NATO. If we have problems there, we go in ourselves. Hey, he said, what's the problem? And he's right. That is how they operate. So what has been the function of NATO since the end of the Cold War? And why are these countries in it? And why is it now almost essential that if you agree to join the European Union, you have to be part of NATO? The only exception is Turkey, which has been a part of NATO for centuries. I'm speaking figuratively, metaphorically, has been part of NATO for ages, but is still not allowed to join the European Union. So this decision by the Turkish elite to effectively become a vassal state, what did it lead to in terms of Turkish development? Political, social, economic. Dictatorships, military dictatorships, brutal dictatorships backed by the United States. Why? In order to keep the left down, when the left was a strong force in this country, and smash it. And in order to smash it, open up alliances with whoever you want inside the country or outside the country, but defeat and smash this left. And the Turkish military did that brutally, and not just the left, as we know, national minorities. So this, what I'm arguing and repeating to you, is that membership of NATO has not been a healthy thing for the development of Turkey as a state. It's not been a good thing. It still carries on. Why? What good is it? Who does it help? And this government, from that point of view of foreign policy, has maintained the continuity. Of course, Erdogan is a more intelligent politician than many of his predecessors. Let's not deny that. He's clever. He knows how to communicate with the masses. He knows how to launch a PR operation. He's very important on creating shows without any substance whatsoever. So you walk out of Davos, so what? Who is the walking out ever damaged? Do you think it really hurts the Israelis that the Turkish leader walked out of us? No. You get an apology on a telephone from Jerusalem where Obama is pinching Netanyahu to make sure he makes the call, and he makes it. And this is suddenly a big victory. But you know, in terms of concrete results, it means very little. And what was the reason that Netanyahu, one of the worst leaders Israel has ever had, and that is saying a lot? Why does he do it? Because they want to carve up Syria, another war which this country is now involved in, quite directly. Now, when I say this, it is not a question of defending the regime in Syria. I've attacked it many, many times over the last 25 years. I attacked it first when it brutally destroyed the previous regime, kicking out of the Ba'ath Party all its Democrats, all its socialists, and established a family rule. I attacked it when it joined the United States in the first Gulf War in Iraq. I attacked it for the repression against its own people at a time when the West quite liked this regime. So for me, it's not a big deal to say that the Assad regime is corrupt and dictatorial. But how it's overthrown and who overthrows it is not an insignificant matter. That's the difference. And here we come to the Arab uprisings. After Tunisia and Egypt, the West, taken by surprise, were determined not to be surprised anymore. So what did they do? The minute something started in Libya, they took it over. And we now know the falsehoods in that campaign, the propaganda in that campaign. I mean, Gaddafi, as we all know, was an eccentric figure, but the West had taken him back. He was a statesman, they said. They proclaimed him as an important figure in the Arab world. And Gaddafi, from his part, did his bit for them. He funded Sarkozy's election campaign. Lots of money went in envelopes. He funded the London School of Economics, in return for which they gave his son a PhD. And one of the supervisors of that PhD was Anne-Marie Slaughter, one of the big foreign State Department academics on Obama's advisors. So they did all that. And then they turned on him. And the reason they turned on him is he had promised them the country. He had promised to privatize. He had promised to let foreign companies come and take over the Libyan coastline and build the beautiful hotels they normally build when they want to destroy a country. They wanted him to privatize the oil. They wanted Libya. He kept prevaricating, because one half of him knew it was a wrong thing to do. And this prevarication and delaying angered them. So when they got their chance, they said, okay, let's take him out. And they did. But after a 6-month bombing campaign by NATO, the casualty figures have not yet been released. Because as we know, they don't count dead Arabs. They didn't count them in Iraq, where over 1 million people died. They haven't counted them in Libya, where on conservative estimates, at least 15,000 to 20,000 people were killed by NATO going in to prevent a massacre. So that's what they did there. This is why I'm saying it's not unimportant what finally happens in a country. And it is linked to these changes, the occupation of Iraq, the creation of an autonomous northern Iraqi region which had existed for a long time before through the years of sanctions, the fact that Assad, desperate, gave the Syrian Kurds autonomy. That is creating the change, I hope it is, a proper change in mood in this country. I am in favor of ending the state of war in this country by the Turkish state against the Kurdish people of this country. It is not an equivalent war. It is a war waged by the state in which at least 40,000 people have died. And it's time this war was brought to an end. So that is, maybe a good thing will result from it. It's early to say. But what I would argue is that in order for a proper deal to take place, it has to be institutionalized constitutionally. It's not something that should just be accepted. It has to be in the Turkish constitution, that national minorities have certain rights, cultural rights, political rights, regional rights, not just the Kurds, all minorities. And then we can say that this will mark a step forward, whatever the reasons and whatever the causes for it. But it hasn't happened as yet. So we shall see. On the other side, I have to say this again in this country. I was shocked when I visited Diyarbakir some years ago to find that an audience, not unlike this, but Kurdish audience, young people, intellectuals, was so obsessed with what they thought were their national interests that they were prepared to do anything, including to back the Iraq war. And we had a 1-hour argument after my speech, like this, bang, 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 in which I explained to them that they were not going to get Kurdish state in this fashion, that there would not even be a Kurdish state in Iraq, and that was foolish of them to imagine this. And in this time, in this world, in the 21st century, there are no states that are truly independent in the Middle East in that sense, because of the enormous strategic importance of this region. So the creation even of a, let's say, a nominal Kurdish state, what would it mean? You break from Turkey, that was the argument, or you break from Iraq, you break from, and then what? You become effectively an Israeli-American protectorate state. And it's short-sighted, because not all the Kurdish people live in regions. That is what they forget. I said this in arguing with the Iraqi Kurds as well. I said Baghdad is a city of which at least a quarter or more are Kurdish. In Istanbul, we don't have the exact figures, 2 million, 3 million, I don't know, but something along that scale of Kurdish people who live in Istanbul. The same in Damascus. The same in Damascus. So what concretely does a very rigid idea of independence mean today? In my view, nothing. Seriously, you just exchange one for the other, and what you get is worse. What it does mean is that you then have the right to behave like politicians everywhere, have your own corrupt politicians, have your own corrupt cronies, have your own private bank accounts in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands, whatever. These are the rights you get. Nothing else. And the best thing is to demand autonomy within a large state, and if that comes out of these negotiations, I think it will be a big step forward. And of course, given that apologies somehow have become very important suddenly in Turkish culture, why doesn't the government then, as a starting point, just apologize to the Kurds? Say we are sorry for what happened. We did it, we are sorry. But they won't do it, because it's a psychological defeat, they think, which it isn't really. It isn't even that. It's a gesture. Let's get up and work together, like the Israelis have done to them. They want to work together. That's why they've done it. If you want to work together with the Kurds, do the same as the Israelis have done to you. So these are interesting times, and the world in this region is shaking a bit. What has happened in Egypt and Tunisia is that you have political organizations which have won elections and come to power, not unlike Erdogan and the AKP. It's the Muslim Brotherhood, slightly different, but not all that different. So you will have what Condoleezza Rice called moderate Islamic governments in many countries in the Middle East, and the United States will be very happy. But what about the people of these countries? What will change? So far, very little has changed. And the big worry that they had, we now know. In Egypt, there was 1 week of waiting after the election results. Remember? 1 week. Why? Because the military in Egypt had put up a stooge candidate, Shafiq, who let's not speculate on how he got his votes, but he had enough votes. So if they wanted, they could say, well, no, the Muslim Brotherhood votes are, they have got them illegally, and Shafiq is the new president. If the Americans had backed that, and then they would have been fine. They would have crushed any rebellion in the streets with US backing, and they would have pretended it's a democracy. But the Americans, I have to say, were cleverer than the Egyptian military. They said, no, let's accept this. But in that week, important discussions took place between Washington and the Brotherhood, which we have read about in the American press, tiny bit, but in the Israel press, a great deal. And in these, Morsi said, we are not going to change our policy towards Israel. Egypt's previous promises will be honored. And the tunnels from Gaza into Egyptian territory are now being blocked with sewage by Morsi. That is how they are helping their comrades in Hamas. And the pressure now on Hamas from the Egyptians, from the Turks, is going to be merge, accept some common organization with the PLO, and then we can negotiate something. It will be a total fraud, by the way, because, and this is a very sad thing to say in public, but I have to say it, the Palestinian national movement has suffered a huge defeat. It has been defeated. And it has been defeated largely by its own leaders who accepted the Oslo Accords and who thought that the Israelis would give them something, instead of which they have got nothing but more occupations, more settlements, more violence, more invasions. So Oslo has been a total disaster for the Palestinian people. And we have a situation in which their leaders have grown rich and corrupt, and their police have acted effectively on the orders of the Israeli army. The reason Hamas was elected was because people wanted a change. And Hamas's incapacity to do anything serious on a strategic front means that it will probably now be pushed by its Egyptian and Turkish friends into doing some form of a compromise. But I am not even opposed to compromises, provided if something that comes out of them is useful. But I don't think it's going to be. I think they might be promised a tiny little Bantustan, an irrelevant little state, which will mean nothing, with no links with each other, cut off from each other. And that will be that, though they might not even get that. And often I'm asked by Palestinians, well, what would you propose? I said, better to acknowledge the reality, not pretend or live in a dream world. And say, there is no Palestinian authority, there never was. Effectively, we are governed and ruled by the Israelis, so we are going to dissolve the Palestinian Authority, and we are the citizens of where we live. It's the problem for the world, not for us. We just want to live as citizens where we are. And if it has to be a single state, it will be a single state, but that's we are. Put the ball in the other court. And the Israeli High Command is totally opposed to the idea of a single state solution because they don't want democracy. The Palestinians who live in Israel are not given equal rights and equal status. We know that. It's an apartheid state, which is why the campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is becoming more and more popular. A former South African government minister for defense, Ronnie Kasrils, himself of Jewish origin, told me when I took a delegation of black South Africans to Palestine and Israel, they came back shocked. They said, but this is worse than what we suffered. So the South Africans are pledged to this now. The ANC is backing the BDS movement. But here in the region itself, they are pretending nothing really has happened. And life goes on as before. So in this situation, we have to say that the Arab Spring has turned very rapidly into winter. And the double standards that exist all the time, non-stop. The uprising in Bahrain is crushed by the Saudis, backed by the United States. That's fine for NATO, because it's a NATO base after all. The US 7th Fleet is based there. And the conflict is sectarianized. So all the young people in the streets of Bahrain who were chanting, we are neither Shia nor Sunni, we are Bahraini, sidelined. This is a war between Shia and Sunni, say the Saudis. And behind that is Tehran. Lies what they feel is the threat of Tehran. But you know, it was not Iran who sectarianized the conflict in Iraq. It was the United States. They went in, they occupied that country, they destroyed every single thing, the military, the civil administration, the entire structure of that country, and handed power to clerical parties. Something they had not done after the Second World War. After the Second World War, they handed power back to Hirohito in Japan, because he was an ally against communism. They kept 70% of the fascist apparatus in Italy to use against communism. They kept the head of German intelligence under the Nazis as one of their people to tell him where all their spies were. And 40 to 50% of the German fascist structure was maintained. So Iraq was worse than all these countries, that you had to completely destroy everything? That's what they did. That's what they did. And the result now is that they have made Iran a very strong regional player. They have done it through their invasion of occupation of Iraq, and they are suddenly developing a Sunni bloc. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf states, to fight the Shias. What has this got to do with anything? And by the way, no one comes out of this story well. The Iranian government backed the occupation of Iraq, backed the occupation of Afghanistan. Why? Because Saddam was their enemy and the Taliban were their enemy. And this sort of nationalism that the enemy of my enemy is my friend is always a very backward-looking nationalism. It leads you into lots of problems. But the result in this case now has been that Iran itself has become the target. They were hoping that they would do a deal with America. They were prepared for it. The Israelis vetoed any deal with Tehran because of the nuclear issue. And this nuclear issue is again a case of double standards. Israel has nuclear weapons, that's fine. Pakistan and India have them, that's fine. China has them, that's fine, but Iran can't have them. Why? It's a much larger country than France and Britain. I'm not in favor of anyone having them, but once they have them, then how can you deny the Iranians the rights to have them? And who are you to decide? So this has become a central issue, though I have to say I have always doubted there will be a direct invasion of Iran, because it's too dangerous for the United States. So they want to destroy Iran by destroying its allies outside. First, the Syrians, they've made 2 attempts to destroy Hezbollah in the Lebanon and failed. But they will probably carry on trying, just reduce its capacities, etc. So this is the context in which we have to see the role that Turkey plays. And in my opinion, it's the role that Turkey has played for a long time. Despite the rhetoric, different rhetoric from different politicians, it carries on doing the same thing. The tragedy is that whereas in the past there was a strong opposition in Turkey to all this, a very strong opposition because people could see it, after the collapse of the global left and the Turkish left, effectively, many people can't see it or don't want to see it. So you have these 63 wise men, some of whom were former leftists, and all of them now who want to collectively mimic Bernard-Henri Lévy, becoming advisors to the government. It's just a tragedy. It's laughable, but it's a tragedy as well, that there is no opposition, serious opposition, I mean, a strategic opposition to this way of thinking. And this is not just the case in Turkey. Turkey is part of a pattern. There is a pattern today in politics. And this is a pattern in the United States and in the most of Europe, that all democracy means is changing faces, not changing policies. So democracy itself, for which people are giving up their lives in Egypt and Tunisia, is becoming an extremely hollowed out process. That is what we are witnessing in the world, and the result is not good. Because without an opposition, the people who come to the top usually, and we can see elements of this in parts of Europe, are the far right, who say to their governments, the center governments, center left or center right, the extreme center I call it, they say you're not going far enough. You're still allowing a few immigrants in, kick them out. Extreme xenophobia, violence, support for wars, the far right does all that. And the one country in Europe where you had the emergence of a mass movement against all this in Greece, which produced a party called Syriza, which came very close to winning the last election. Every single major European leader went to Greece and appealed to the Greek people, don't vote for them, you will be destroyed, you will be finished, frightening people. And they won by a few percent, the right-wing coalition. But none of these European leaders made a single reference to the rise of Greek fascism, and I call it fascism, because the Golden Dawn group in Greece are fascists. They have a swastika as their flag, and they openly say in many cases, yes, Hitler was a good guy, he did good things. And they target Pakistani Muslim migrants. They say Islam is not part of civilization. We know we gave the world civilization. And all this nonsense they talk endlessly goes unchallenged in the mainstream European press, who spend all their time attacking Syriza. And they went even crazier when Alex Tsipras, the leader of Syriza, said, is there any politician you admire in the world? And he said, yes, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He had to travel a long way to find a politician. And then they went completely crazy. This is the Chavez of Europe, it said, because Chavez is the late Hugo Chavez was a big bogeyman for the extreme center in Europe and the United States. Now, what do we do in this situation? You know, all we can do is fight back. There's nothing more to be done, and hope that sooner or later people will realize what's going on, that new movements will arise, new parties will be created. Of one thing I'm sure, that any attempt to found new small groups of 10 or 20 on the left, sectarian groups of one sort or the other whose main time is spent in fighting each other is not what the world needs today, if ever it needed it. We need broad-based, broad leftist parties and movements like Syriza, like the South American Bolivarian movements, if something is going to change. In the Arab world, that has not happened so far. I hope it will. There are many people in Egypt very hostile to the present government, but it can't be defeated just like that. It's a popular government. It's an elected government. You have to find an alternative and produce an alternative which can defeat it in parliamentary elections, not simply on the streets, because you can now fight elections unless they change that. So that, I think, is the way forward. It's not an easy way, but it's all we can do today. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah. I'm also happy not to answer questions. Yeah.
Thank you. What's the impact of America and America's economic politics at the moment, which is declining, and seems to be the public opinion seems to be becoming, although gradually, conscious of the world balance and the occupation of the military forces, giving them job to do because they have a big budget. So they should use that big budget by employing the unemployment. In that respect, have you got any words to say?
Well, I mean, the United States at the moment is certainly not doing that, despite the fact that many liberal left economists are advising it to do that. They won't do it because the ideology under which they function is an ideology of neoliberalism. They haven't broken from that. I mean, if you read some of the books out by, mainstream Americans, they say that one whose author's name I can't remember went and interviewed all the Wall Street bankers. And he said that after the 2008 crash in Wall Street, they knew they were to blame because it was not a secret. Their irresponsibility had done it, and of course backed by the politicians. So when Obama called them in soon after being elected, they thought, this is it, he's now going to slap us and say, you're the sons of bitches who did this, and these are the regulations we are going to impose. And they said, we couldn't have stopped him. On the contrary, we were taken by surprise. He greeted us like long-lost friends and said, don't worry, we're going to sort it out, no bank is going to suffer, etc., etc. So the United States hasn't broken from that. At the same time, the spending the state does is concentrated heavily, state spending is concentrated heavily on the military-industrial spending. I mean, they have now military bases of one sort or another in nearly 90 countries of the world. Much, much more than they ever had during the Cold War. And the reason for this is to make sure that US hegemony is not challenged. And where it is challenged, they intervene in some form or the other. And that is the way they have decided to play it, because economically they feel, with some justification, that the center of the world market has now shifted eastwards. China is in effect producing the bulk of the world's cheap commodities, and sometimes not so cheap ones it's either. and is the dominant economic power. But militarily it is nothing. And it doesn't want to be anything either except from defending its own territory. So the only way the US can maintain hegemony in the rest of the world is through military actions, which is why they've created AFRICOM recently, to make sure that the African continent, which trades hugely with China, it doesn't go away from them. And so they're intervening there. You have wars, you have so-called Al-Qaeda, which we thought was wiped out after Osama was assassinated, suddenly is appearing everywhere again. I remember I was in Yemen a few years ago, just to see the country in right now, say about 4 or 5 years ago. And there was a place in southern Yemen where people were scared to go in the Hadramaut, and I went with my interpreters and I went into the town from where there had been a supposed attack that had killed Japanese tourists, and the government had said Al-Qaeda and got lots of American weapons and money. And I asked the leaders of that town, I said, you know, be honest, and I won't even write it if you don't want me to, but what is the strength of Al-Qaeda? And they looked at each other in amazement, then at me, and burst out laughing. They said, Al-Qaeda doesn't exist in this town. I said, what about the attack on the Japanese tourists? They said, it didn't come from here. And then one of them came and whispered in my ear, do you know where the Al-Qaeda headquarters are? And I said, where? He said, in the presidential palace. They use these actions to provoke, to create fear, and to get money from the United States. And we know what the secret state is capable of doing. I mean, we know it from the history of this country, carrying out killings, blaming them on the Kurds. I mean, it's not an uncommon thing. Or in Russia, blowing up buildings and blaming them on the Chechens. So the Yemenis do this. It's a common thing that they learn. And I asked a former prime minister, who is still very a big figure in the... How many Al-Qaeda are there in Yemen? He said maximum 200. So I said, these guys are the reason for all this American military presence here. It's a joke. So he said, that's your opinion. I said, yeah, of course it's my opinion. I'm not going to quote you saying it. So that's the way they function. They have not learnt anything, nor have the Europeans. I mean, Europe is in a complete mess, total and complete mess economically. All these little states, Croatia, etc., etc. Well, what are they? They're EU colonies. In the old days, they used to sing happy birthday to Tito on his birthday. Young pioneers would wear their hats and red scarves and sing happy birthday, Comrade Tito. Now they sing happy birthday, European Union. I asked many of them, it was better. They said, yeah, it was much better under Tito. Now they said, we feel colonized. And our leaders, whether it's Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, are totally and completely corrupt politicians who do nothing for us. And then the collapse in Italy, the collapse in Spain, the collapse in Ireland, they've learnt no lessons from it at all. So Turkey, in some senses, should consider itself lucky it's not in the European Union. But, you know, not being in the European Union is not sufficient. A country has to learn to be independent also. And, but I honestly don't know how long this union, in its present shape and structure and financial architecture, will last. 10 years, perhaps that's too long. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes. Well.
Have you got a mic?
I've got one. I've got a question.
Just shout.
You alluded to the recent settlement between the PKK and. Yes. Sorry. You alluded to the recent settlement between the PKK and Erdogan, and I wondered what you think the background might be, and whether there may be a risk that sectarianism might be introduced to the Kurdish movement, because we all know there are Sunni elements in it and Alevi elements, and there's quite in the Kurdish movement. So do you see a risk that the Sunni elements may be strengthened and that religion is brought back into the conflict?
Well, you know, it depends. It depends on what the settlement is and how it takes place, and if it happens, by the way, of which we shouldn't be totally sure. I mean, the huge demonstration in Diyarbakir last week, I think it was huge. That showed that people are fed up, you know. They see no way they can get a solution out of the present impasse. And the PKK is not, it's one group amongst many in Europe which went through the same phase. The IRA, the Basque separatists, all similar, different but similar in some capacities. They all, when they reached an impasse or where the armed struggle couldn't go any further, it was caught up, and actually continuing with the armed struggle was beginning to affect the character, social composition of the organization itself, in the sense that violence became the dominant factor and not ideology or political aims. All these groups began to go under and collapse. And the Basque terrorist group, ETA, lost because the Basque population abandoned it. And they had many, that's a good model for the Kurdish people. The rights that the Spanish Centre has given the Basques are exemplary, by the way, in my opinion, till now. They could have more, but they have got a lot. So if this is all going to be linked up with the Turkish war on Syria, and persuading Öcalan maybe that he should go into exile with some of his armed group into Syrian Kurdistan, who knows what the effect that will be. You're right, there is a danger that the conflict within the Kurds could be sectarianized, but let's hope that that doesn't happen. I mean, there are some people who might want it to happen, to weaken them, but let's hope it doesn't happen. That's why I'm saying that the key thing is politics and strategy, which I have yet to hear coming out from them, but it's obvious. And I don't want to repeat what I said earlier. Cast iron guarantees in the Turkish constitution. Now, will these be permitted? I don't know. But that's what has to be fought for, because signing a thing on a piece of paper means nothing unless it is guaranteed by constitutional changes. And that will transform the character on that level of the Turkish state, which was very much modeled on French republicanism. And French republicanism itself is in a huge state of crisis, by the way, where it uses that republicanism to discriminate both against the Corsicans but also against the Maghrebian immigrants who have been coming to France since the Second World War. So suddenly it becomes a big thing for the French, what Muslims in France were. It never used to be before. Now it becomes a big thing because they use it. And sometimes I feel that the French Republican definition of secularism is anything that's not Muslim. You can be a Christian, you can go to Mass, you can be a Jew, you can wear your skull caps, you can wear your crosses, but if you are a Muslim, even a secular Muslim, you are not really secular, because if you were, you wouldn't be a Muslim. And this is unacceptable.
The economic blocks are the reality of today's world, as we all know, and there is one which is doing, I think, internally quite interesting stuff. BRICS, what I have in my mind, and including setting up their own alternative to IMF, seemingly, and also using barter in their international trade. I mean, not very significant at this point, but at least there are some experimentation in that regard. So I'm wondering in your view, what is the prospect of this grouping evolving into some sort of political bloc? I mean, do you see any potentiality in it as an alternative to the other one we have?
The most interesting experiment, political experiment taking place is in South America, where a number of countries have united, not in terms of creating a federation or anything like that, but have united underneath the banner of a common economic policy, a common foreign policy. Which are these countries? Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Cuba, of course, has existed for a long time, and to a limited extent Brazil. Brazil didn't buy the economic policies of the Bolivarians, and these economic policies essentially, in my opinion, are left social democratic policies backed by mass mobilizations. So they use the state and the wealth of the state for free schooling, free universities, free libraries, free facilities, free housing in some cases, which is now being implemented for half the population, if not more. That is what explains their popularities. How the oil money is used. Contrast that with the Arab world, where they have enough oil to educate the whole world, leave alone the Muslim world. They don't do it. They don't do it, and one reason they don't do it is because they are defended and kept in power by the United States, effectively. No one ever talks about a spring in Saudi Arabia. It would be crushed very quickly, especially given now that they've sectarianized the conflicts. And they know that a majority of those who live in the oil-producing areas are Shia. No one hears about the Saudi Shia, but they are, and they feel oppressed and repressed by the Wahhabis, as many Sunnis do as well. But South America is, I think, an interesting model for the Arab world and for this region as a whole, but you're not allowed to even think about it, leave alone go near it. It's forbidden. Haram. Not allowed. As for the BRICS, I mean, they are independent of the United States. I was saying about Brazil that even though economically it hasn't changed too much, politically it refuses to allow Brazil to be used as a base of operations to destabilize the other countries. They said very clearly, Lula said no. And when the Economist and the Financial Times and the Western press developed this big thing, there are two types of leaders in Latin America, Lula and Chavez. We support Lula. And they tried to use it recently in the elections. Lula went public. He said, I don't care who you support, I support Chavez, because he is very important for our whole continent. That shut them up, and then they started attacking Lula as well. He's proved unreliable. It's always the way. So Russia and China follow their own policies which are of narrow self-interest. They have no principles at all. They just do what is in their interest. They don't think about others necessarily. The Chinese and Russians recently said we mustn't allow the Americans to sanction Iran. They cut down the sanctions. They said we are not going to stop trading with Iran because it helps both of them. Iranian oil and energy resources are important for them. So they won't allow it to be done. India is effectively very closely working with the United States. Despite its past and neutralism and all non-alignment, that's all gone. The Indian elite is completely Americanized, in my opinion. Not the population, but the elite, like here. Not so different. So there's not too much to be hoped for. One last thing, since Ahmed Tonak raised the question of the economy, there is this illusion that in Turkey at the moment, we are safe. Europe is going down, things are not good, but we are doing quite well. It's an illusion. If you look at the Turkish economy over the last 40 years, there have been crashes and booms, crashes and booms, crashes and booms, regardless of which government was in power. And many of the systemic aberrations that have affected the rest of Europe will affect Turkey too. Its banks, I know that we are talking in a very old bank, a British bank as it was first set up, but called the Ottoman Bank. The people who set up this bank would have been astonished by what the British banks have been up to. Only yesterday a parliamentary committee said that HBOC, its 3 top executives, shouldn't be allowed to work in the city again because they are rogues and crooks. And many of the other bankers are like that. And you know, let me tell you something. I don't think Turkish bankers have received a revelation that tells them not to behave like this. And not just the bankers, many, many other things too. So don't expect this to carry on. I was in Cyprus several months ago where some of the Cypriots were expressing the same sort of confidence, mainly Greek Cypriot. We are not like Greece. We are safe. You know, our money is safe. 5 months, 6 months later, that crashes. All that vanity disappears very quickly. And it's not a clever thing.
I want to ask about another alternative to the European Union or to NATO. It's me again.
Sorry, where are you? Ah, okay.
Yeah, the so-called Eurasian alignment to which Turkey's been asked to be an observer, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. It goes underreported in most media, and it's an interesting constellation.
It depends, you know, in these organizations, what always depends is why a particular country is in there, what are its reasons, what are its motives. Without having any evidence for this, for what I'm going to say, let's put it like this. It wouldn't surprise me if the United States wanted Turkey to be part of that, to have someone in there. They're always operating like that. The British were sent into the European Union, even though General de Gaulle had warned the European Union, or its predecessors, the EEC, to have the British in the European network will bring an American Trojan horse, and they will destroy us. And by expanding it, which was essentially a US-British thing, expand, 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 they have actually more or less confirmed de Gaulle's view. So Turkey's role in the Shanghai setup is probably not dissimilar, in my opinion.
Thank you very much for this wonderful speech and for being here. I'd like to ask something about your speech, actually. You have mentioned the collapse of the global left and the collapse of the Turkish left. How do you think Turkish left in particular can develop a sane opposition without falling into the trap of secularists versus Muslims? Because in my opinion, it all comes down, the opposition in Turkey right now, it all comes down to some perceptions about the lifestyle, about drinking alcohol or other things. How do you think a sane opposition from left can be developed? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, look, the collapse of the global left is a very long subject. I've written about it in many places, but it would require a whole discussion, which I can't go into now. But let's recognize that it's happened. If I can summarize it very briefly, I would say that the worst drawback of the Soviet political system was the political structures of the state that were institutionalized in the late 20s, in which no opposition was permitted at all, neither in the media nor in the party which was ruling the state. And once you create that structure and then proclaim to the world that this is the most progressive structure possible, then you set up something which is difficult to pull out of without a very, very long struggles. And unfortunately, this model, single party, decisions made right at the very top, usually by a single leader, has been a big disaster for the left. And this has affected every country in which you had huge communist or Marxist-Leninist movements. I mean, there are people sitting here, I'm not going to name them, who were beaten up on the streets by other groups on the left who thought that they were traitors for raising critical questions. If that is what you're going to do when you're not in power, Allah protect us from you if you ever come to power. Because that is how you would operate. And that model, I think, is the model one has to break with completely. Completely. It was very specific to Tsarist Russia, which was an autocratic, vicious dictatorship that they had to exist in conditions of clandestinity. And in some countries where you still do, or you still used to, it's understandable to create a cast iron party, but this is not the case in most parts of the world. And I think the left has to rethink how it functions and how it exists, and to create the most open movements possible. And you don't have to agree with a political party of which you're a member on every single issue. You can challenge it, you can discuss it, while accepting the broad outlook of such a party. The model of Syriza in Greece is a good model. Actually, it would work well in Turkey. And in Greece also, you have very similar traditions as in Turkey, in far as the left is concerned. A very dogmatic, Stalinist left party, vicious in the way it deals with other people, uncritical towards people it's trying to recruit. A party which usually puts sociology, i.e. your class origins, before politics. This is not the world in which you can repeat that, if ever it was a world in which you could do it. So, you know, there's no magic formula for creating new political organizations which can be applied everywhere. That would be to fall into the same trap. Each country has specific features, and the local progressives have to understand those and analyze those and see what can be constructed from that. I mean, you can look at this, what I've described to you, even in how the PKK functions. You know, I've defended it against repression, but its own functioning, its own style, its over-dependence and cult of the personality about one leader has not been healthy for the Kurdish movement, let me tell you that. And it would be good if something else could be created. So what I'm saying doesn't just apply to, it is generally applicable. That's it. Yeah, I'll take one more question. Yeah. No?
I think that some steps towards creating a left that is moving away from a doctarian situation, a violent situation, is actually looking at the world, Turkey and its problems, its neighbors, and the international situation, and trying to create something that is with people, with the environment, and with the oppressed or the minorities, as we call them, and is forging links between all those different that Turkey has. Turkey is a very multicultural society with many big problems. So a new left needs to address all those problems in a constructive way, and in a way that actually furthers dialogue between all those different sections of society who are actually fighting in their own strand, in their own ghettos sometimes. So I think a new party has been established, a Green Left Future Party, and it is trying to make the beginnings of this process, which is not categorically anti-AKP. Says if something is good, it is good. If something is bad, it is bad. It's not categorically secularist or anti-secularist. It's not categorically anything, but looks at the concrete situations, trying to provide concrete answers, and it's fighting to actually build a new left and rebuild the left tradition that is actually answers, provides some answers to the questions of the 21st century and the world we live in a globalized world, and a world where the ecology is being decimated by neoliberalism, and all those issues that can have come together and we are experienced as human beings. So there are projects, and I think these are projects of hope, which really need to build also on international experiences and forge international alliances. It wasn't a question, just to say, yes, something is happening here.
No, I understand that. All I would say to you is I don't know about the Green Left in Turkey so well. I have not studied its policies or politics, or its the composition of its leaders, so I can't comment on that. But what I can comment on is the German Greens, who have become, who started off by saying some of the things you've said today, and ended up supporting NATO's wars, supporting Afghanistan very harshly. Some of them supported Iraq, not as a party but as individuals. Today they play a role where they want to replace the Free Democrats as the main party which builds alliances with the other two. Total staunch supporters of neoliberalism. So that is one green model which I hope that you will reject. And the other role which I think any modern party of the left has to play is very sharp analysis and very sharp critical attitude to the governments in power, regardless of whether it's the AKP or something else, when they are doing things which I have described for the last 1 hour that they're doing. So simply saying we won't be sectarian to them, well, one shouldn't be sectarian to anyone, in my opinion. But that doesn't release one from the obligation of being very sharply critical to what is going on. And it would be wonderful if a party of the left could emerge in Turkey which unites all the people who have lived in this country and there, for centuries. It would be very good if that happened. So whether it's going to, I don't know. I will, when I get back, I will try and find your statements on the web and see who's in this party to get some idea. Thank you very much.